The trouble started on a muggy August morning, the kind where the air sticks to your skin and the cicadas hum like a warning. I was out by the creek that runs along the edge of my property, checking the wild blackberry bushes I'd been tending for years. The creek itself is part of an easement, a shared strip of land that's supposed to stay open for all the neighbors. That's when I saw it, a row of metal fence posts, freshly driven into the ground, slicing right through the path I used to reach the water. They weren't there yesterday. I knew who was behind it before I even saw her. Karen Davis, my next-door neighbor and self-appointed queen of the HOA, had been sniffing around the boundary line for weeks, muttering about encroachments and property values. She'd always had a knack for turning molehills into mountains, whether it was finding someone for a mailbox that was half an inch too tall or sending cease and desist letters over unapproved garden gnomes. But this was a new level of audacity. I grabbed my phone and snapped a few photos of the posts, their shiny tops glinting in the sunlight. The posts were planted deep, with concrete bases that screamed permanence. They blocked not just my path but the entire easement, cutting off access to the creek for everyone on this side of the subdivision. I could already picture Karen's smug grin, probably sipping her iced coffee while plotting her next power move. I wasn't about to let this slide, but I knew better than to storm over and give her the shouting match she craved. Instead, I headed inside, pulled up the county's property records, and printed out the plat map that clearly showed the easement's boundaries. I also dug out the deed restrictions, which explicitly prohibited any structures within 10 feet of the creek. Armed with my paperwork, I walked over to Karen's house, a McMansion with perfectly manicured zoysia grass and a fountain that looked like it belonged in a Vegas casino. She answered the door in yoga pants and a visor, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. "What do you want?" she asked, not even pretending to be neighborly. "Karen, those fence posts you put up are on the easement," I said, keeping my tone even. "They're illegal. I've got the plat map and deed restrictions right here." Her eyes narrowed and she crossed her arms. "That's my land. I had it surveyed and I'm protecting my investment. You've been trespassing for years and I'm done with it." I held up the plat map, pointing to the clearly marked easement. "This says otherwise. The creek access is shared. You can't block it." She didn't even glance at the papers. "I don't care what your little map says. My surveyor knows the law and so does my lawyer. You're not getting away with this." I could feel my patience thinning, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a fight. "Fine," I said. "Let's let the county sort it out." I turned and walked away, her scoff following me like a bad smell. By noon, I'd filed a complaint with the county planning office, attaching my documentation and photos of the posts. I also called the HOA president, a tired retiree named Gary who'd been steamrolled by Karen for years. He sighed heavily and promised to look into it, which I knew meant nothing. Karen was the HOA's unofficial enforcer, and Gary wasn't about to pick a fight with her. I thought that might be the end of it, at least for a while, but Karen had other plans. The next morning, I woke up to a sheriff's cruiser parked in my driveway. Deputy Rogers, a lanky guy with a no-nonsense mustache, was at my door. "Got a call about a property dispute," he said, holding a notepad. "Mind if I take a look?" I showed him the fence posts and handed over my paperwork. He skimmed the plat map, walked the boundary line, and nodded. "Looks clear to me. This is an easement, and those posts shouldn't be there." He jotted a few notes, then headed to Karen's house. I watched from my porch as Karen gestured wildly, pointing at the creek and then at my house. Deputy Rogers just stood there, arms crossed, letting her rant. After a few minutes, he handed her a business card, said something that made her face turn beet red, and walked back to his cruiser. As he passed my yard, he tipped his hat, told her to take it up with the county. "Have a good day." I thought that would shut her down. Karen, however, wasn't the type to back off. If I'd known then how far she'd take it, vandalism, fraud, even dragging in a local crook like Chandler, I might have braced myself harder. But at that moment, with the sheriff driving away and the creek sparkling in the sun, I just felt a flicker of victory. Too bad Karen was already plotting her next move. 2 weeks after Karen's fence post fiasco, I came home from work to a scene that made my stomach drop. My wooden fence along the creek was slashed in 3 places, splintered boards hanging like broken bones. Deep tire tracks gouged the mud near the easement, and one of my beehives, home to a colony I'd nurtured for 2 years, lay in ruins. Its frames were scattered across the grass, honey oozing into the dirt like spilled gold. The air buzzed with confused bees, their home destroyed. I was still processing the damage when I heard a yelp. Pixel, my border collie, limped toward me, favoring her front paw. My heart sank as I knelt and found a nail board, a cruel trap of wood studded with rusty nails, half buried near the fence line. One nail had pierced Pixel's paw. I pried it out gently, her whimpers cutting through me, and rushed her to the vet. Dr. Ellison cleaned the wound, prescribed antibiotics, and warned me to watch for infection. Who would leave something like that out there? She asked. I didn't answer, but I had a pretty good guess. Fury simmered in my chest, but I wasn't about to let it cloud my judgment. Karen had escalated from petty to criminal, and I needed to be smarter than her. That night I ordered 4 motion sensor cameras with night vision, each capable of sending real-time alerts to my phone every 10 seconds until I silenced them. I also called Nora Beltran, a licensed surveyor I'd met through a friend. Nora was a no-nonsense woman with a crew cut and a reputation for precision. "I'll mark your property so clearly even a toddler could understand it," she promised. Nora arrived the next day, her truck loaded with fluorescent orange stakes and a theodolite that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. She spent hours measuring the boundary, cross-referencing my plat map with county records. By dusk, she'd driven stakes into every corner of my property and attached laminated placards to each one, warning of criminal penalties for tampering with survey monuments. "Let's see them mess with that," she said, wiping sweat from her brow. I barely slept that night, my phone propped on my nightstand, waiting for the cameras to ping. At 1:13 a.m. they did. My screen lit up with a live feed, 2 figures in hoodies creeping along the creek. One, taller and lanky, carried bolt cutters that glinted in the moonlight. The other, shorter with platinum blonde hair spilling from her hood, yanked Nora's stakes from the ground and tossed them into the water. My pulse raced as I saved the footage, zooming in on the taller figure's face. The moonlight caught his features just long enough for a clear shot. I called Deputy Rogers at dawn, emailing him the video before he even arrived. He showed up with a thermos of coffee and a grim expression. "Let's take a look," he said. We watched the footage together on my laptop, pausing when the taller figure's face came into view. Rogers leaned forward. "Well, I'll be damned, that's Chandler Hicks. Known him since he got pinched for shoplifting in 19. The blonde figure didn't need identifying. Karen's hair and her distinctive swagger, shoulders back like she owned the world, were unmistakable. Rogers nodded slowly. "Got enough here for a warrant, criminal mischief and trespassing at minimum." By 6 a.m., Rogers had a judge's signature. He and 2 deputies rolled up to Chandler's rundown duplex across town. I wasn't there, but the body cam footage, which I later saw at the station, told the story. Chandler answered the door in pajama pants, hair sticking up like a startled rooster. "I was asleep all night," he insisted, voice cracking. Rogers didn't blink. He held up a printed still from my camera, Chandler mid-grimace, bolt cutters in hand. Chandler's mouth snapped shut. Karen's arrest was less dramatic, but just as satisfying. Rogers found Nora's stolen stakes stacked neatly in her garage, next to a half-empty can of spray paint, neon green, the same color defacing my no trespassing signs. A pile of Nora's laminated placards sat in a trash bin, some still legible. Karen tried to play dumb, claiming Chandler had stored tools in her garage without her knowledge. Rogers wasn't buying it. "Ma'am, you're on camera tossing stakes into the creek," he said flatly. Both were cuffed and hauled to county jail. Karen made bond by noon, her lawyer already spinning excuses. Chandler wasn't so lucky. His 2021 check-kiting conviction had him on probation, and this stunt landed him on a no-bond hold pending a revocation hearing. As Rogers drove away, he tipped his hat to me again. "Good work with those cameras," he said. "This ain't over, but it's a start." It was a start, all right. But as I bandaged Pixel's paw and surveyed the wreckage of my beehive, I knew Karen and Chandler had more in store. I just didn't know how deep their schemes ran or how much evidence I'd need to bury them. With Chandler cooling his heels in county jail, the real bombshell was still ticking. My lawyer, Elliot, a wiry guy with a knack for sniffing out financial dirt, suggested we dig into the HOA's records. Corinne's illegal fence posts and the $3,500 gate she'd erected on the easement didn't just appear out of thin air. "Let's follow the money," Elliot said, adjusting his glasses. I gave him the green light and he subpoenaed the HOA's financials, zeroing in on the reserve account meant for community upkeep. What we found was a paper trail straight out of a crime novel. A cashier's check for the gate, signed by Chandler Hicks, had been drawn from the HOA's reserves, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Elliot uncovered a series of checks totaling $46,900, all written by Chandler for grounds improvements that never happened. Phantom landscaping projects, non-existent irrigation upgrades, even a $12,000 consulting fee funneled directly into Corinne's personal bank account. The gate was just the latest in a string of scams Chandler had been running under the HOA's nose. The HOA board, a mix of retirees and overworked professionals, was blindsided. At an emergency meeting, Gary, the weary president, read Elliot's report and turned pale. "This is fraud," he stammered. "Chandler's been our bookkeeper for 3 years. The board voted unanimously to press charges, and the case was handed to Detective Miriam Page, a white-collar crime specialist with a reputation for dismantling paper empires." Page didn't waste time. She executed a search warrant on Chandler's duplex, seizing his home computer and a stack of external drives. What she found was a goldmine: forged receipts, fake HOA meeting minutes, and a Word template for the neon green approval stamps Chandler used to authenticate his bogus invoices. There were even emails between Chandler and Corinne discussing how to secure my land for the HOA's expansion. One message from Corinne read, "Handle the stakes tonight and we'll split the parcel once it's annexed." It was as close to a smoking gun as you could get. Corinne, meanwhile, lawyered up fast. Her attorney, James Hall, charged $600 an hour and had a handshake that felt like a contract. He refused to answer questions, issuing a statement that Corinne was a victim of Chandler's deceit and had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. It was a bold lie, but Corinne's bank account told a different story. Page traced $8,500 of the HOA's missing funds to her, labeled as consulting services for projects that existed only on paper. Hall could spin all he wanted. Corinne was neck deep. Chandler, facing probation revocation for his 2021 check kiting scheme and new felony charges for theft and fraud, saw the walls closing in. His public defender, a harried woman named Leela, convinced him to cooperate. "You're looking at 7 years minimum," she told him bluntly. "Talk and the DA might cut you a deal." Chandler didn't need to be asked twice. He agreed to testify against Corinne, detailing how she'd masterminded the land grab and used him as her errand boy for the dirty work. Page interviewed Chandler in a Stark County jail room, his orange jumpsuit clashing with his nervous fidgeting. He spilled everything: Corinne's plan to annex my property for the HOA, her promise of a cut of the land's value, and her orders to destroy my fence and beehive to send a message. He even admitted to planting the nail board that hurt Pixel, though he swore it was Corinne's idea. "She said it'd scare you off," he mumbled, avoiding Page's gaze. The testimony was a game changer. Elliot filed a civil suit against Corinne and Chandler for damages to my property, while Page built a criminal case that was airtight. The HOA, desperate to distance itself from the scandal, sent me a formal letter of apology and promised to cover the cost of my ruined beehive. Gary personally delivered a $1,200 check, his hands shaking as he muttered, "We had no idea." As the legal gears turned, I started to feel the weight lifting. Pixel's paw was healing, and the bees that survived the attack were rebuilding in a new hive I'd set up. Nora Beltran's fluorescent stake still stood proudly along my property line, untouched since the arrests. I even caught Corinne's neighbors, a quiet couple who'd always avoided her, giving me a thumbs up as they walked their dog. It wasn't full victory yet. Corinne was still out on bond, and Chandler's plea deal was pending. But the evidence was stacking up, and for the first time I felt like I was ahead. Corinne's empire of petty tyranny was crumbling, and I was ready to see it fall. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, packed with HOA members, curious neighbors, and a few reporters sniffing out a juicy local scandal. I sat in the front row, my hands folded, as the prosecutor laid out the case against Karen Davis and Chandler Hicks. Months of evidence, my camera footage, Detective Page's financial forensics, and Chandler's damning testimony had built a fortress of a case. Karen, in a navy blazer and a scowl, sat beside her $600 an hour attorney, James Hall, who looked like he was already billing for his next vacation. Chandler, in contrast, slouched in his chair, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of his no-bond status. Chandler's plea deal was the first domino to fall. Facing probation revocation for his 2021 check-kiting scheme, plus new felony charges for theft, fraud, and conspiracy, he'd agreed to testify for a reduced sentence. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, accepted his guilty plea, sentencing him to 18 months for the probation violation, plus a 4-year term for the new charges with parole eligibility in 2 years. Chandler nodded numbly, his eyes fixed on the floor. His testimony, though, was the real prize. Taking the stand, Chandler spun a tale of greed and manipulation. He described how Karen had recruited him to secure my land for the HOA, promising him a slice of the annexed property's value. She orchestrated the vandalism, my fence, my beehive, even the nailboard that hurt Pixel, to intimidate me into backing off. Chandler handled the dirty work, from cutting fences to forging HOA checks, all under Karen's orders. She said it was her land by right, he testified, his voice low. I just did what she told me. The prosecutor played my Ring camera footage, a grainy but unmistakable video of Karen and Chandler loading rebar into her SUV at 12:47 a.m. the night Nora's survey stakes vanished. The timestamp was a gut punch, tying them directly to the crime. Karen's face, caught in the moonlight, was as clear as day. Hall tried to argue the footage was inconclusive, but the jury wasn't buying it. After a 3-day trial, they deliberated for just 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: felony conspiracy, theft, criminal mischief, and misdemeanor trespass. Karen's sentencing was a spectacle. The judge didn't mince words, calling her actions a calculated abuse of power that harmed not just me but the entire community. She got 18 months in prison, $32,000 in restitution to me for property damage, and $46,900 to the HOA for the embezzled funds. A 5-year no-contact order was slapped on her, effective after her release. As the bailiff cuffed her, Karen's composure cracked, her eyes darting to the gallery. I met her gaze and gave a small, polite wave, not out of spite, but because it felt like closing a chapter. She looked away, her jaw tight. With the legal battles behind me, I turned to rebuilding. The disputed land, once a battleground, became the site of my new greenhouse. I spent weekends hammering frames and laying gravel, the air thick with the scent of fresh soil and tomato starts. The bees, resilient as ever, buzzed in their new hive, and Pixel's paw healed completely, her sprints across the yard a daily reminder of what we'd endured. The greenhouse wasn't just a structure, it was a declaration that Karen's schemes hadn't won. The HOA, shaken by the scandal, started to heal too. A new board took over, led by a no-nonsense accountant named Sheila who vowed to audit every penny. They sent me a $4,500 check from Chandler's frozen assets to cover the beehive repairs, along with a letter apologizing for past oversights. I didn't need the apology, but the gesture felt like progress. Small wins kept piling up. Neighbors who'd once dodged my eye now stopped to chat, sharing stories of Karen's HOA tyranny. One couple, the Wilsons, brought me a jar of homemade peach jam as a thank you for standing up to her. Even Deputy Rogers swung by one afternoon off-duty to check on Pixel. You did good, he said, scratching her ears. Not many folks would have fought this hard. As spring crept in, I walked the creek path again, Nora's fluorescent stakes still standing like sentinels. The easement was open, the water sparkling under the sun. Karen and Chandler were gone, one in prison, the other awaiting parole, and their schemes had unraveled. The land was mine, not just on paper, but in spirit. I planted a row of sunflowers along the creek, their bright faces turned to the sky, and felt something like peace. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a damn good start. With Karen and Chandler behind bars, the air around my property felt lighter, like a storm had finally passed. The creek sparkled under the spring sun, and the easement, once a battleground, was quiet except for the hum of my bees. The greenhouse I'd built on the disputed land was thriving, its glass panels catching the light as tomato vines curled toward the ceiling. Pixel, my border collie, was back to her old self, chasing squirrels with a limp-free stride. The scars of the past year, smashed beehives, cut fences, and that awful nailboard, were fading, replaced by growth and possibility. The HOA, eager to distance itself from Karen's reign of terror, underwent a transformation. A new board took over, led by Sheila, a meticulous accountant who'd moved into the neighborhood just months before. At their first meeting, they voted to overhaul the financial system, implementing monthly audits and a public ledger. Sheila personally delivered a $4,500 check to my doorstep, funds recovered from Chandler's frozen accounts to cover the cost of my destroyed beehive. "We're sorry," she said, her eyes earnest. "This never should have happened." I nodded, tucking the check away. The money was nice, but the gesture meant more, a sign the community was ready to move forward. My own recovery was quieter, but just as deliberate. I spent mornings in the greenhouse, pruning basil and harvesting peppers, the earthy scent grounding me. The bees, resilient as ever, had rebuilt their colony, and I added a second hive to keep up with their productivity. Pixel patrolled the property, her tail wagging as she sniffed the wild blackberries along the creek. The land felt secure, not just because of Nora's fluorescent stakes, but because the fight was over. I'd won, not just in court, but in the small, daily ways that mattered. Then came an unexpected twist. A woman named Elaine Castor, claiming to be Karen's cousin and heir, sent me a certified letter asserting a private right-of-way across my land. The document, a shoddily typed deed, smelled like a last-ditch effort to stir trouble. I called Elliot, my lawyer, who laughed when he saw it. "This is amateur hour," he said, pointing out the mismatched fonts and a notary stamp that looked suspiciously photocopied. He filed a motion to challenge the claim, and Nora's survey records, still pristine in my filing cabinet, confirmed the easement was untouchable. Elaine withdrew her claim before the court date, her letter of retraction curt and unsigned. It was a blip, but it reminded me how far Karen's shadow had stretched. The neighborhood began to knit itself back together. The Wilsons, a quiet couple who lived in Karen's crosshairs for years, invited me over for coffee. They shared stories of her petty fines, one for a non-compliant birdhouse, another for a car parked an inch over their driveway line. "You took her down," Mrs. Wilson said, passing me a slice of pound cake. "We all owe you." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I hadn't fought for glory. I'd fought for my land, my bees, and Pixel's safety. But their gratitude felt like a small victory, a sign the HOA's old fear-driven days were gone. I started exploring new opportunities. The greenhouse was producing more than I could eat, so I began selling surplus herbs and honey at the local farmer's market. My stall, a simple table with mason jars and handwritten labels, drew a steady crowd. A few neighbors even stopped by, their purchases a quiet show of support. I toyed with the idea of expanding, maybe a small online shop for my honey or a community garden plot on my land. The possibilities felt endless, each one a step away from the chaos Karen had wrought. One evening, as I locked up the greenhouse, I found a letter tucked under my door. It was from Gary, the former HOA president, now retired from the board. He thanked me for exposing Chandler's fraud, which had saved the HOA from financial ruin. Enclosed was a photo of the creek, taken from his backyard, with a note, "It's peaceful again." I pinned it to my fridge next to a picture of Pixel midleap. The contrast, hostility to harmony, was stark. As summer approached, I walked the creek path, the same one Karen had tried to steal. The wild blackberries were ripening, and the sunflowers I'd planted swayed in the breeze. The land was mine, not just legally, but in the way it felt under my boots, in the buzz of the bees, in Pixel's joyful bounds. The fight had been brutal, but it had carved out this new beginning. I wasn't just surviving, I was building something better, one seed, one jar of honey, one sunny day at a time. A year after Karen and Chandler's convictions, my life had settled into a rhythm of quiet victories. The greenhouse hummed with life, its shelves heavy with peppers and herbs. The bees thrived in their new hives, and Pixel bounded along the creek path, her paw long-heeled. The easement, once a war zone, was peaceful, marked by Nora's fluorescent stakes standing like silent guardians. But the story wasn't quite over. Loose ends have a way of circling back. One morning, a letter arrived from the state's crime victim fund. Karen's prison wages, garnished at $58 a month, had started trickling in as restitution. It'd take decades to cover the $32,000 she owed me, let alone the $46,900 to the HOA, but the symbolism hit hard. Every penny was a reminder of her fall, a small but steady drip of justice. I tucked the check into a drawer, not sure whether to frame it or cash it. Then came a surprise from Chandler. A manila envelope postmarked from the state penitentiary held a letter in his shaky scrawl. He'd earned a paralegal certificate behind bars and was working in the prison library. "I'm sorry for the harm I caused," he wrote. "I was greedy and Karen used that." Enclosed was a hand-drawn map of my property with neat annotations suggesting spots for an orchard, apple trees by the creek, pears near the greenhouse. It was an odd gesture, almost earnest. I wrote back mentioning the sunflowers now towering over the easement, but made no promises. Forgiveness wasn't there yet, but the letter felt like a step toward something human. The biggest twist came from Karen's old property. Sprout Tomorrow, an organic farming nonprofit, had bought her McMansion at auction, tearing up her pristine lawn to plant a community garden. They reached out, inviting me to consult on native pollinators to boost their yields. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen's land, once a monument to her control, would now feed the neighborhood. I agreed, driving over with a notebook and a jar of my honey as a gift. Their director, a wiry woman named Lena, walked me through the site. Raised beds were already taking shape, with volunteers hauling compost and staking tomato vines. "This is our fresh start," Lena said, gesturing to the dirt where Karen's fountain once gurgled. I suggested milkweed and coneflowers to attract bees, sketching a layout for a pollinator strip. As we talked, a familiar figure pulled up, Deputy Rogers off duty, dropping off a load of mulch. He grinned when he saw me. "Didn't expect you here," he said, shaking my hand. The garden was more than a project, it was a reclamation. Karen had ruled through fear, wielding HOA fines like a scepter. Now her land was a place of growth, of community. I loaned Sprout Tomorrow my brush cutter for their first volunteer day, watching as new HOA members, free of Karen's shadow, joined in. The air smelled of fresh earth and possibility, a stark contrast to the hostility that once choked this place. As I drove home, the creek glittered in the dusk, reflecting the sunflowers' golden heads. The fight with Karen and Chandler had been brutal, but it had led here, to restitution, to a garden, to a strange, hopeful letter from a man in prison. I didn't know what the future held, but for now the circle felt complete. The land was mine, the bees were buzzing, and the neighborhood was healing. That was enough. A year after Karen and Chandler's convictions, the scars of their schemes had faded, replaced by the steady pulse of renewal. My greenhouse thrived, its shelves bursting with basil and heirloom tomatoes, while the bees hummed in their rebuilt hives. Pixel, my border collie, raced along the creek path, her paw fully healed, chasing dragonflies through the easement that was now undeniably mine. Nora's fluorescent stake stood proud, untouched, marking a boundary no one dared challenge. But the story wasn't done weaving its final threads. Justice has a way of coming full circle. One crisp spring morning, a letter from the state's crime victim fund landed in my mailbox. Karen's prison wages, garnished at a meager $58 a month, had begun trickling in as restitution. It'd take decades to cover the $32,000 she owed me and the $46,900 to the HOA, but each check was a quiet victory, a reminder that her empire of petty tyranny was dust. I slid the first payment into a drawer, half tempted to frame it as a trophy. Then came an unexpected note from Chandler. Postmarked from the penitentiary, it was written in careful, almost boyish handwriting. He'd earned a paralegal certificate and was working in the prison library, trying to make something of himself. "I'm sorry for the damage I did," he wrote. "Karen pulled the strings, but I chose to follow." Tucked inside was a hand-drawn map of my property, with spots marked for an orchard, apple trees by the creek, pears near the greenhouse. It was a strange, almost touching gesture. I wrote back, mentioning the sunflowers now towering over the easement, their golden heads swaying in the breeze. I didn't promise absolution, but the exchange felt like a small bridge over a deep chasm. The real triumph, though, was unfolding on Karen's old property. Sprout Tomorrow, an organic farming nonprofit, had bought her McMansion at auction, ripping out her manicured zoysia grass to create a community garden. They invited me to consult on native pollinators, a poetic twist that made me smile. Karen's land, once a stage for her HOA power trips, would now nourish the neighborhood she'd terrorized. I drove over with a jar of my honey and a notebook, ready to help. Lena, the nonprofit's director, greeted me with a firm handshake. The site was alive with volunteers, neighbors, new HOA members, even a few kids hauling wheelbarrows. Raised beds brimmed with zucchini and kale, and tomato vines climbed sturdy trellises. "This is our chance to build something good," Lena said, pointing to the dirt where Karen's gaudy fountain once stood. I suggested planting milkweed and coneflowers to draw bees, sketching a pollinator strip along the garden's edge. As we talked, a familiar pickup rolled up, Deputy Rogers off duty, unloading bags of compost. He grinned, tipping his hat. "You're everywhere, aren't you?" he teased. The garden's first volunteer day was a revelation. I loaned Sprout Tomorrow my brush cutter, watching as the community came together. Sheila, the new HOA president, shoveled mulch alongside Gary, the former president, both laughing over shared relief at Karen's absence. Neighbors who'd once cowered under her fines now planted carrots and swapped stories. The air smelled of fresh soil and hope, a stark contrast to the tension that once choked this street. Karen's lawn, her symbol of control, was now a patchwork of growth, radishes, sunflowers, and the promise of harvests to come. As I worked, I felt the weight of the past year lift. Karen and Chandler's schemes, vandalism, fraud, that cruel nailboard had tested me, but they'd also forged something stronger. The garden was more than dirt and plants. It was a middle finger to their greed, a testament to what community could be without their poison. Rogers clapped my shoulder as he left, his voice low. "You turned this around, not many could." Driving home, I passed the creek, its water catching the late sun. My sunflowers stood tall, their roots deep in the land I'd fought for. The greenhouse glowed in the distance, a beacon of my fresh start. Chandler's letter, Karen's garnished wages, the garden sprouting from her old lawn, it all wove together, a circle closed. The fight had been brutal, but it had yielded this. A neighborhood reborn, a dog sprinting free, and a quiet certainty that I'd not just survived, but won. The victory wasn't loud, but it was final, rooted in the earth and stretching toward the sky. October brought Sprout Tomorrow's harvest dinner, held on Karen's former lawn, now a vibrant community garden. Tables groaned under dishes sourced from the soil. Roasted butternut squash, garlic honey carrots, heirloom tomato bruschetta. Neighbors laughed, clinking glasses as kids darted through rows of sunflowers. Lena, the nonprofit's director, gave me a nod